But the little fox girl didn't flee. Didn't move. Hi, Prim croaked. She wasn't afraid, just like she was never afraid when she found Buttercup yowling in the rain as a kitten. The little fox girl said nothing. She just stared. Prim rubbed her eyes, trying to clear the headache. Marvel. Marvel hit her and left her. He left her. She shouldn't be surprised. She glanced around just to make sure. He's gone, isn't he? The little fox girl nodded. What's your name? You're from District 5, right? Fox girl glanced around, looked at the ground, then snapped her side round eyes back up to Prim's face. Vixenite. Her voice was a whisper, barely a whisper, as though she opened her mouth and the wind brought the name to Prim's ears. Vixenite. Perfect. The perfect name for the little fox girl. Prim grinned. You've been following me, haven't you? Vixenite nodded again and touched her fingers to her lips, then rotated her palm down. A form of sign language, but what did the sign mean? Was that another way of saying yes? Thank you, Vixenite whispered again, repeating the sign. For what? Prim rotated her neck, rubbing the bulge on the back of her head as she did. Vixenite pinched the fingers of one hand together and tapped them 3 times against her lips. Prim didn't need to know sign language to know that she was referring to eating. To food. Why didn't you come out sooner? You knew I wouldn't hurt you. Vixenite's eyes darted away from Prim and focused on the forest, the direction Marvel and Prim had been traveling. Prim didn't blame her. Marvel was intimidating, and Prim couldn't guarantee that he wouldn't have killed Vixenite on the spot. How long was I out? Vixenite held up one finger. 1 day. 1 day. Marvel had hit her hard. Was she missing brain cells? Memories? How would she know? Did anyone die? Vixenite held up 3 fingers. Prim covered her mouth. 3 tributes. Rue and Peter. She just knew it. It had to be. Vixenite shook her head. The boy from 3. Breath whooshed out of Prim, though she felt guilty at her relief. 10 tributes left. She didn't know she'd been mentally keeping track. Just to double-check her memory, she went through the list of surviving tributes. District 1, Glimmer and Swallow, Marvel. Her Marvel. District 2, Cato and Clove. District 3, Dead. District 4, Dead. District 5, Vixenite. District 6, 7, 8, and 9, Dead. District 10, the male tribute. District 11, Rue and Thresh. District 12, her and Peter. What was Prim's plan of action now? Marvel was a whole day ahead of her. He was probably already at the cornucopia with Cato and Clove and the rest of the group. He'd said they had a camp there. At least Prim had that information now. Since he hadn't died, Prim could assume that Cato took Marvel back. If she went after him, there was no way he'd rejoin her. Besides, then Vixenite would leave. She didn't trust Marvel. That left Prim with only one option. I'd like to find Peter and Rue, if that's okay. Want to join me? Vixenite nodded. I know where they are. Peter is hurt. Hurt? How? Who? Fire. Vixenite stood up, lithe and long-limbed. On her back was a drawstring bag covered in a sheet of plastic. It bulged out against her back, filled to the brim with something round. Blood marred one half of the cloth bag. Had Vixenite killed someone to get this? In blind trust, Prim followed her into the forest. She didn't make a single sound as she traveled. Even Katniss would be impressed by her stealth. Prim followed, self-conscious about every step and noise she made. Vixenite didn't seem to mind, or at least she didn't say anything. Besides, she'd been following Prim for days. She knew Prim's weaknesses. She knew Prim's weaknesses. Prim chewed on the thought, and a needle of doubt, fear, mistrust, slipped into her brain. Foxfiss was sly. Mysterious. Stealthy. Perhaps she knew more than just Prim's physical weaknesses. Maybe she revealed herself to Prim because she knew Prim's internal weakness for trusting people. For saving people. For not killing. The questions ate away at Prim and she hated them. Why now? Why did she suddenly suspect Vixen it? Prim knew how to read people, but in this case she had no confidence. Was it from the concussion that Marvel gave her? Did that steal away her trust? Her intuition? Or was Vixen simply not trustworthy? She said she knew where Peter and Rue were, but she could be taking Prim anywhere. This could all be part of her plan. 29. Vixen had endless energy. On and on and on they traveled, barely speaking because of Vixen's apparent shyness. Prim stayed as alert as possible despite her fatigue, despite the agony in her head. Dizziness. She couldn't seem to think straight and found her mind drifting away into no man's land every half hour or so. She'd be easy prey right now. As they walked, she let her mind drift into a dangerous place of thinking, of longing. She thought about being home with Mom and Buttercup and Katniss, worrying about small things like whether or not Katniss and Gale would get caught hunting, or what Katniss's wedding dress would look like. Family. It was all Prim cared about. She never really understood this about herself until now. Home could be found wherever family was. Is that what prompted her to start befriending tributes? Because it gave her a sense of family. Safety. Home. Prim once overheard Katniss and Gale talking about Mom. Katniss had a tough time loving Mom after Mom had her breakdown from Dad's death. Gale told her, "You're born with your family. It's your choice to love them the way you should." It was the first time Prim had internally disagreed with Gale. Yes, she was born into her family, but family could be found everywhere, in Prim's opinion. Why did she have to be connected by blood in order to love people the way she should? "Do you have family, Vixen?" Vixen startled as though she'd forgotten Prim was there. She shook her head. No one. Another head shake. What had happened to her family? Maybe people in District 5 weren't allowed to stay with their families. Why not? Vixen started making some hand gestures, but then glanced over her shoulder at Prim. Electrocuted. Power accident. I live alone. A lump choked Prim. Vixen's family was electrocuted. It seemed every district had its own horrible accidents. District 12, mine collapses. District 5, electrocution accidents. I'm so sorry. Vixen shrugged and surged forward. We will reach your tribute friends tomorrow. Let's find a place to sleep. Then you gather food. Prim's dizziness increased at the idea of going out and gathering food for the two of them. Was that why Vixen wanted her as an ally? Because she didn't know what was edible from nature. She was just a scavenger. No matter, Prim would help. Vixen was taking her back to Peter and Rue. Prim owed her. They found a fallen log and Vixen set to burrowing beneath the soft dirt, just like a little fox. Prim dragged her feet and gathered berries with bleary eyes, not paying too much attention to their colors in the forthcoming darkness. She stripped one whole bush of dark berries and wrapped them up in a washed cloth bandage. Those could be for tomorrow, so she wouldn't have to scavenge more. She returned to the camp with a paltry gathering of nuts, berries, and mint leaves. She'd grown used to the aching call of hunger in her belly. Maybe that was why she was so tired, lack of enough food. Oh well. Mint leaves would serve to trick her stomach into feeling full. Katniss worked that out when they were starving at home. Prim used to hate mint, knowing it wasn't real sustenance. They didn't start a fire. The sun set fully, but the moon reflected the puff of air that came from Prim's mouth every time she breathed. This night was colder than previous nights. Body heat would be a precious gift tonight. Still chewing on the nuts, Vixen crawled into her small burrow, shoving her giant round pack down by her feet. Then she scooped dirt over herself and closed her eyes. Prim stood staring at her, feeling exposed and alone. No body heat tonight. How had she been foolish enough to think Vixen would become instant family like Rue and Peter? Tears burned her eyes, but she swallowed them down. She needed that moisture to stay in her body, keep her hydrated. She dug her own spot under the log, getting dirt caked under her fingernails. It wasn't as deep as Vixen's when she climbed in, but by that point her fingers had numbed from the chill. The anthem played and the face of the boy from District 3 hovered in the sky. Prim crawled into her burrow and scooped the dirt over herself. It was cold, like getting into a bed that had been sitting beneath an open winter window for a few hours. Shivering, Prim forced her eyes to close, trying not to think of the crawlies beneath the dirt or the dirt crumbs sneaking down the collar of her coat. Morning came with a shake. Prim startled with a gasp. Vixenette removed her hand from Prim's shoulder, then jerked her head toward the forest. Time to go. Prim's muscles were sluggish and her head like a frozen fishbowl. A headache pounded behind her eyes, reminding her of Marvel's betrayal and the new chill in the night air. She needed food. They needed water. Vixenette started walking, slinging her awkward pack over her shoulders. No mention of food. Prim envied her ability to function off so little sustenance and hydration. By noon, Prim was certain the game makers were enacting a new plan of torture. The sun had grown hot, hotter than an overhead bonfire. She couldn't swallow anymore, but Vixenette trudged on. If only Prim had the small water bottle. She stumbled. Vixenette didn't stop. Didn't seem to care. A flash of anger hit Prim's heart, followed closely by surprise at herself. How could she be angry with Vixenette when she was taking her to Peter? Why was it so easy to continue caring about Marvel when he only wanted to kill them all, yet with Vixenette it didn't come naturally at all, even after she watched over Prim post Marvel's knockout. River. Vixenette climbed a few rocks and there they were at the river. It was flowing again as though the game makers had never dried it up or scorched it. Prim fell to all fours at the bank and lifted water to her mouth with her cupped hand. The freshness, coolness, pressed back the headache and thirst like a rejuvenating poultice. She stared into the calm pool of swirling water, allowing it to hypnotize her, drawing her out of the games for a moment. A waver of color interrupted the flow of cool darkness. Red. Vixenette, above her. Prim whipped her head around just as Vixenette shoved her face under water. 30. Prim's first instinct was to gasp, which sent a gulp of water into her lungs. She choked. Then writhed because, if she didn't get above this river water in less than a second, she'd drown. No. 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 Anything but drowning. Anything but suffocation. Vixenette pushed harder, shoving the rest of Prim's body into the river. A hand tangled in her hair and yanked her face out of the water. Prim tried to suck in a breath, but coughed instead. Vixenette slapped a hand over Prim's mouth. Be quiet. Prim coughed again. Air. She needed air. They were both in the river now, the current carrying them away from the bank. Prim shoved Vixenette away and retched until she managed a thin forced breath past the constriction in her throat. She flipped onto her back and scuttled away from Vixenette, pushing at the loose river bottom. Vixenette looked just as terrified as Prim felt. Prim didn't have enough breath to scream for help, but now it didn't seem like Vixenette was planning to kill her. Vixenette held a single finger to her lips, grabbed a boulder mid-river and held still, peeking over the edge. Her blue-jean black pack floated on the water, held up by the waterproof coat she'd tied around it. That's when Prim heard the voices moving away from them. Not just any voices. Cato's voice. They're close by. Probably hiding. We'll get 'em, Cato. Clove's voice. We'll get 'em all. Thresh'll be tough. Clove cackled. No he won't. We'll just find the little dark girl and make her scream until he comes out of his hiding place by the lake. He was all big brother to her during training. They were on the bank Prim and Vixenette had been on moments earlier. Prim couldn't see them yet, but she pulled herself behind a lodged log and yanked her black hood over her hair. She put it together. Vixenette had shoved her into the water because she saw or heard Cato and Clove. That must have been it. She was saving Prim's life, right? It wasn't the best way to do it. She could have just covered Prim's mouth with her hand, but now that Prim realized Cato and Clove were near, she placed her trust back in Vixenette. If Vixenette had wanted to kill her, she would have. Prim had no strength and no fight. The current pushed her flimsy body sideways and she clung to the log with her trembling fingers. Fear. Not cold. The refreshment of the water rejuvenated her, which was good because they'd probably have to flee soon. Or die. Rue. Peter, Prim hissed to Vixenette. She pointed in the direction Cato and Clove were heading. We have to warn them. Not speaking a response, Vixnut slid beneath the current and let it carry her, but she kept her pack floating atop the water. Why didn't she pull it under? It was a beacon like that. Prim let Vixnut get a few yards downstream before she followed suit. They'd have to float past Cato and Clove. She didn't want to be near that black beacon of a backpack if the District 2 tributes spotted Vixnut. But, if she and Vixnut remained quiet and didn't splash, the rushing sound of water would them. Prim let out half her air and drifted below the water. As she flowed, a captive to its whim, she squinted her eyes open. Sunlight flashed through the water above, winking and grinning. Innocent. Joyful. Even as her lungs burned, she didn't want to come up for air. She wanted to stay down there, playing a wink game with the sun in the silence of the river ride. With one swoop of her arms, she got her head out of the water of a single half-breath. She didn't want to breathe too deeply or else she'd float. Back down she went. She didn't have the energy or time to worry about Cato or Clove. If she was going to die today, it'd be underneath this lovely water, conversing with the sunlight. How easy it was to hold her breath when she was calm. What if she did die today? What would happen to her? She'd never really thought about it before. Mom said that Dad was just waiting for all of them. Prim liked the idea of joining her dad somewhere, but was that just an adult saying something mothers told their young daughters to comfort them? Was Dad really up somewhere, waiting for Prim? Her calm fled. She didn't want to die until she knew. Until she knew what would happen. Why had no one ever talked about this? They all said, 12 is too young. And Prim agreed. She'd barely started life. Was it really such a blink of existence and then, nothing? No, there had to be something else. Something more. Otherwise, what was the purpose? She poked her head up again, peeked at the bank. Trees. Green. She couldn't hear voices over the river, but it seemed like she'd been floating quite a ways. After a few more submerged floats, she risked a scan for Vixnut. There she was, clawing her way onto the opposite bank. Prim swam toward her, remembering all too well how she shoved her underwater. Should she rejoin the little fox? Her heart thudded as she reached the bank. Vixnut busied herself with brushing water off her black bulging pack. I'm sorry. Prim smiled, wringing the water out of her hair. You saved my life. Right. I didn't mean for you to choke. Vixnut turned and her squinted eyes held back tears, or was that just river water? Do you still trust me? Prim wanted to say yes. She really did. But she refused to lie. I'm working on it. That seemed good enough for Vixnut. She flashed Prim a shy smile, hoisted her pack on her back, and off they went into the forest. Running. Flying. Off to find Peter and Rue before the couriers did. They ran for an hour and the river water dried, turning to sweat. Soon. Vixnut hardly sounded winded. Soon. Her head barely tilted as her eyes darted side to side with every step for every minute, every hour. Alert. That's how she hadn't been caught yet. Prim had a feeling that Vixnut would only get caught in the games if she revealed herself. She might just win this thing. And Prim's heart burned because of it. She wanted Peter to win. And Rue. And, Marvel. Her whole family. Curse these games. Vixnut slowed and started studying the ground. They crept along. Her ears twitched at every sound, every bird flutter and snapped branch beneath Prim's foot. Like a fox. Here. Prim followed as they rounded the back of a mossy boulder. That's when the knife blade came out of nowhere, clamped in a small brown fist and held up against Vixnut's throat. Rue. Prim dashed forward. No. Rue's eyebrows shot up. Prim. The words came out in a frantic rush. Yes. Vixnut helped me find you. Please, she's on our side. She's part of our, she swallowed, family. Rue lowered the knife and just in time because a magnified voice startled them all and Rue jerked so violently her dagger would have slit Vixnut's throat then and there. Claudius Templar Smith's voice congratulated those who had survived. He was saying something confusing. A rule change. A rule change. Under the new rule, Both tributes from the same district will be declared winners if they are the last two alive. 31. Thresh. Rue gasped. Prim stood still, trying to process what this meant. Something inside her felt joy, hope, even. But when she broke it all down, that still meant that people, friends, would die. Is Peter still alive? Yes, he is. Peter emerged from the cave with a limp in his leg and half his pants burned away. The skin beneath glowed raw pink. He pulled Prim into a tight, trembling hug. You're okay. I thought for sure when that cannon went off that it'd be you. I thought it was you, she mumbled into his jacket. Can we go after Thresh? Rue looked up at Peter. He let out a long sigh and held Prim at arm's length. I see you've brought us back another family member. He jerked his head toward Vixnut. What happened to Marvel? He left and rejoined the Couriers. The Couriers. Prim's fingers tightened against Peter's wrists. Cato and Clove are coming for you. We have to go. Her eyes drifted down toward his leg. It's not that bad. I got a parachute from Haymitch with burn cream. You should have seen it when I first got hit. Rue practically fainted. Rue hit him playfully on the arm. Did not. They seemed much more like a brother and sister than the last time they were all together. It must have been because they survived together the past several days. So, District 5. Peter narrowed his gaze at Vixnut. Vixnut's eyes darted around the forest, avoiding Peter's gaze. Prim trusts everyone, but I won't trust you until you prove yourself. She saved my life, Prim piped up. And you saved Marvel's life, but he never trusted us and never became trustworthy. Peter folded his arms and leaned against the boulder, relieving the pressure off his leg. Prim wanted to tell him how Marvel spared her life, but she didn't think he'd see it the same way since Marvel also held a dagger to her throat. Peter jerked his head toward the boulder. Come on, this turns into a cave down below. We've got fish. He acted different, more accepting of the fact that he'd be part of a team now. Not so focused on juggling who to trust and who to kill. But what did that mean for them? How would this all end? They clambered down into the cave. It was huge, almost as big as the living room of Prim's house in 12. Lines of fish hung against the wall, already cooked from some past fire. Vixnut hovered back in the shadow against the cave wall, not joining in, but Prim went straight to the fish and tossed one to Vixnut. She caught it without a word and started eating. I have to find Thresh. Rue handed the dagger back to Peter. Prim recalled what Cato and Clove had said. He's by the lake. In that portion of ground that disappeared on the other side of the cornucopia. She licked the fish oil off her fingers and then picked out another chunk of meat. We need to go soon. Cato and Clove are coming. I think they will have turned around after the announcement. Peter pulled a small silver tin from his pocket and unscrewed the cap. If they know that Thresh is there, they'll use this as an opportunity to catch him or Rue. But if they catch him, we have to save him. Rue's voice grew more frantic. She scuffed her feet back and forth as though barely able to keep herself in the cave. Peter's movements remained smooth and calm as he spread a gelatinous paste on his leg wound. Then what, Rue? If we help you get together with Thresh, will you agree to part ways? Part ways? Prim stopped with her hand halfway to her mouth. She'd just found them. The capital's giving us a chance, Prim. Peter wiped the excess paste into the can and re-screwed the lid. The viewers don't want to watch all of us die just because we've decided to join a team and not kill anyone. The capital is relenting a little, allowing two of us to win instead of just one. We can't keep taking advantage of the rules. It felt odd talking so openly about parting ways and killing tributes, but Rue didn't say anything. She just stood by the door of the cave, ready to head out at a moment's notice. Vixnut just ate her fish. What would happen to her? She didn't have her fellow tribute left. No matter what, she would have to win alone. But Prim wouldn't let her die alone. I think we should help Rue connect with Thresh. Then we can see what he wants to do. The idea of traveling again increased the ache in Prim's feet. When do you think we should go? Now. Rue took another step toward the opening. We need to get there before Cato and Clove. They might go try to kill him. Or try to find us. Peter stood. But I'll take you where you want to go. Resigned. He'd become resigned. It was a different type of Peter. Not a survivor, but a big brother. He turned toward Vixnut. Are you coming? She had no reason to go with. Her loyalty didn't run deep to anyone, not even Prim. She looked up from her fish. I will go for another reason. She took a bite. Chewed. Everyone waited on her. We blow up their food. Peter's brow furrowed. How would we blow it up? District 3. Explosives. Dug up the mines and reactivated them. I know the path through. Prim wasn't getting the full picture, but Peter's face smoothed out and his eyes turned distant as though he could visualize it. Of course they did. They are hoarders and set a trap. He focused on Vixnut again. You really know your way through them. Every mine. I know where every mine is. She picked at her fish again. I stole their food. She was much more foxy and sneaky than Prim had imagined. She'd been snatching food from the couriers and they never even knew it. If they blew up their food and belongings, then the couriers would have to start fending for themselves. So that's why you joined us. Prim smiled. Because we can feed you without you having to sneak into the courier camp. And you can distract the couriers. Vixnut spoke more boldly, as though laying everything out on the table. We go get her guy. She nodded her head toward Rue, and while you distract the 4 couriers, I blow up the food. F4 couriers. Prim had only been imagining Cato and Clove, but Foxfist kept track better than her. Marvel. Glimmer. Prim couldn't fight Marvel. But maybe that was a good thing, maybe he wouldn't fight her either. Well, let's go then. Peter picked up the spear he'd stolen from Marvel. Let's try to get to Thresh before the couriers do and then we can avoid this whole distract them thing altogether. They left the cave, Prim's feet screaming at her to stop, but she walked on. For some reason, she had a feeling this whole plan would end badly. For some reason, she was certain at least one of her family members would die. 32. I'm doing something dangerous. Deadly. I'm beginning to hope. I need to stop because that's exactly what the game makers want me to do. They want me to hope and then they'll want to rip that rug out from beneath my feet. But, can they really rip this rug out? They said both tributes from the same district could win. That means Prim and Peter. Even better, Prim has now found Peter, with the help of conniving little Foxfist. I don't care what Prim said, I think Foxfist was trying to drown her but stopped because she heard Cato and Clove. I hate Foxfist. I hate her more than any other tribute except maybe Cato because she's smart. Too smart. Smarter than I would have been in the games. She has a secret weapon in that backpack of hers. I saw her get it. Saw her stuff the pack with it. No one but us viewers know what she's done and it was brilliant. It will kill everyone if she gets them all in the same location close together, which is exactly what she's doing. She's joining them on their foolhardy mission to get Thresh. Don't they realize Thresh is the smartest of the bunch? He's survived on his own, he's killed, he's tough, and he's staked his claim on that giant field by the cornucopia. He doesn't need anyone to come get him. Rue, Peter, Prim, and Foxfist need to just stay in that stupid cave of theirs and wait for him. Well, not Foxfist. She needs to die. I grip the screen and watch them traipse off toward the cornucopia because my little duck is so set on saving everyone. Peter's almost walking normally. I'm so proud of Haymitch for spending our money like that. It's perfect and multi-purposed. When he returns from the capital, I might not punch him. That's how thankful I am. That cream can help most wounds. Granted, I would have liked Haymitch to send Peter a bomb that could kill everyone except him and Prim, but I don't think that's allowed. How's your boyfriend doing? Gale saunters into the house, 2 dead turkeys over his shoulder. Good. Something to keep my hands busy. I don't respond to his jibe even though it shreds my nerves like a potato peeler. How dare he? How dare he suggest that I like Peter in that way? I told Gale I'd marry him, we've grown up together, We've kissed and planned a wedding ceremony together, and I proudly wear on my finger the wooden ring he carved for me. Yet he doubts me. It's so, Gale like. Okay, never mind. I'm not going to ignore his jibe. What's wrong with you? Is it so evil of me to hope that he'll save my sister's life? You're not just hoping, Katniss. He slams a metal bucket in front of me and flops onto our dusty couch, tossing me a turkey. You obsess over him. Because he's Prim's only hope. I rip a fistful of turkey feathers out and throw them into the bucket. It brings little satisfaction as they just flutter around, some onto the floor. What do you want me to do? You can't control the games. Just come out hunting with me instead. And what if Prim dies while I'm out there? I squeak on the last word, but I force myself not to think about it. No, she's going to win. Peter will make sure she wins. What if Mom's all alone in this house, watching Prim die, and then holing up again? You can't help that. His voice is low and, though he rips out feathers by the handful, he does it gently, as though the bird is still alive. You're with me, now. You can't help your mom. If she holes up again, we'll take care of her, but that's all we can do. So that's it. We just walk around and, if my little sister gets stabbed in the back, then we'll just go on living as a happy couple while my mother goes crazy. I hold the turkey, limp in my hand. What about me, Gale? You think I'll recover? You think I'll just be able to go on and be a happy little hunting wife? He stares at the floor. I see what you're saying. I won't be enough for you. For heaven's sake. Men. How absurd. This isn't about that. This is about trying to move past what's happening in our lives. And what if Prim dies and Peter comes back fine? Then what? What if Prim dies? His words echo in my mind and he must see something in my face because his arms drop. I'm sorry, Katniss. That was stupid. Yes, it was. He lets the turkey fall to the floor and then wraps his arms around me, but I'm a statue, internally and externally. I don't understand Gale. I can't understand him today, and it's the first time that's ever happened to me. I'm sorry, Katniss. Let's just move on, okay? He gestures toward the screen. You're right. Peter will get Prim home. I know he will. But turning back to the screen brings no comfort, because there's my sister, holding Peter's hand on one side and Ruse on the other. And Fox Fizz is behind them, tightening the straps on her weapon backpack. My little duck and the boy with the bread are walking to their deaths. 33. Prim's footsteps grew more and more leaden the closer they got to the cornucopia. They were minutes away. No more talking, not that they'd done much of it during the hike anyway. This felt foolish, and her confidence wavered with that understanding. Foolishness. Yet, if it was foolish, wouldn't Peter have said something? Wouldn't he have stopped them from going? Or had he already given up on the games? Peter threw out an arm and held a finger to his lips. They all stopped walking. Prim strained her ears, as though by thinking harder she'd be able to make out more sound. She heard it, so misplaced in the games that it sounded almost feral. Laughter. Not happy laughter like around a bonfire, but sick laughter. Taunting laughter. The laughter that came before a killing. Cato. Prim halted her instinctual urge to flee. Rue led the team forward and they crouched behind the trees on the edge of the cornucopia clearing. At least now they knew Cato wasn't tracking them, but Rue's gasp made this new situation seem worse. The couriers had caught Thresh. He stood in the middle of a courier circle, clotted blood covering his head and dripping into his eye. No ropes bound him, but neither did he have any weapons. Cato, Clove, Glimmer, the boy from 10, and, Gulp, Marvel poked at him with spears or swords, like a sick game of monkey in the middle. Thresh lunged after some of the weapons, but the ring of attacks kept him at bay. Cato laughed. Prim's heartstrings wept when a brief grin crossed Marvel's face as he jabbed the back of Thresh's thigh. Thresh was already weak, stumbling around and trying to grab a weapon. He'd go down with a fight, but that's what made all this worse. The couriers knew that and they wanted to whittle him down until he was nothing more than an exhausted plaything. Instead of sorrow, something else built inside of Prim. Something stronger, fiercer, and dangerous. Anger. Before she knew it, she had her sling out of her waistband and sent a stone flying into the forehead of the boy from 10. She gasped, she'd only meant to hit his weapon hand. He dropped like a felled tree and it launched the rest of her family into action. Rue burst from the trees with a scream, followed by Peter who hurled a dagger. Fox Fizz ran to the right, toward the giant pile of food and belongings. Prim stumbled after them, both horrified at what she'd done and ready to do it some more. The moment her eyes met Marvel's, the smile vanished from his face. Something like fury, regret, and defiance jumbled behind his eyes. Cato spread his arms wide as though to welcome the charge. Peter bowled over Clove before she had a chance to throw her daggers. She hissed like a cat and scrambled back to her feet, but Peter fought too close for her to get a dagger out. Rue tussled with Glimmer, which gave Thresh the opening he needed to break free. 2 steps took him to Rue and he yanked Glimmer off of her, throwing Glimmer across the field like a ragdoll. Then he went for Cato. One-on-one with a beefy guy like Thresh, Cato didn't stand a chance, and he knew it. He stumbled backward, but Thresh advanced. Prim didn't want to see them connect. She stood in the middle of the fray, unsure what to do. They fought all around her, but the boy from District 10 lay still on the grass, tripped over and ignored. Had she killed him? Had she finally cracked and turned into the monster she feared this whole time? She had no more time than that to think. Someone rammed into her, flattening her to the ground. Marvel. He was on top of her in a flash, grabbing fistfuls of her coat and slamming her against the ground. I hate you. I hate you. Why are you here? She refused to cry. He'd never understand the bond of family like she wanted him to. Maybe he was simply a killer and always would be. But he wasn't killing her. He was just looking like he was fighting her. He shoved his hand in her face, pushing it into the dirt. Just stay down, idiot. Then he was off, running toward someone else. Prim breathed hard, trying to block out the mayhem around her. What should she do? A cannon boomed and she shot into a sitting position. Peter. Rue. Marvel. Her eyes found Vixen at first, who was very much alive and wasn't blowing up the food. Instead, she wrestled with the ties of her stuffed backpack, her eyes flitting from the knot to the group of wrestling people, back to the knot again. Frantic. Fingers flying. A crumpled thick blue tarp laid beside her on the ground, gathered possibly from the pile of supplies. Prim rose to her feet. Did Vixen need help? What was she trying to do? The backpack strand was loose. Vixen pulled the strings free, yanked the top open, and then threw the whole backpack into the center of the circle of fighters before covering herself in the blue top. A tracker-jacker nest tumbled free of the pack and burst open. 34. The buzz of tracker-jackers came like an explosion. Prim scrambled to her feet, her reflexes moving her before her brain could catch up. No one else had seen the nest yet. Couldn't they hear the buzz? Sense the danger? She filled her lungs with the biggest breath she could muster between adrenaline gasps. Tracker-jackers. Her explosive scream shook her from her shock and she scrambled toward the first person who entered her mind. It wasn't Marvel. It wasn't Rue. It certainly wasn't Vixen. Peter. He wrestled on the ground with Clove who had a knife clutched in her fist. Prim used her momentum and kicked Clove in the shoulder. That gave Peter the opening he needed and thankfully, he leapt up and took Prim's hand. They ran. Someone screamed. A second cannon boomed and a sting shocked Prim on the back of the neck. She yelped, but Peter dragged her after him. Run, Prim. Run. She didn't need telling twice. What about our family? Pray they survive. He wasn't going to rescue them. He couldn't. Prim couldn't. No one could fight off the tracker-jackers. So Prim did exactly what Peter suggested as she ran and her breathing echoed in her ears. If there's anyone who hears prayers, please protect my family. Another tracker-jacker stung her arm. Her vision went blurry and, beside her, Peter stumbled. Then they reached the lake. Prim didn't care if Kato was right behind her or if the lake was filled with poison, or if crocodiles would eat her. She tumbled into the water and let herself sink. The coolness crept straight to her stings, soothing them, eliminating the treacherous buzz of the trackers. But she needed air within seconds. Her heart pumped too fast from the sprint. She spun beneath the water and popped her head up so as to face shore. A single tracker jacker hovered above her, but she dipped back under before it could sting. In that short time above water, she saw bodies strewn about on the grass before the cornucopia. 2. 3. 4. A hovercraft was sending down a claw. Who died? The odds of it being a family member were high. Too high. Beneath the surface she heard a jolted buzzing, like a fly caught in a web. She blinked her eyes open and spotted tracker jackers, diving beneath the surface toward her. No, that couldn't be right. They couldn't function underwater. She shook her head and the vision disappeared. The stilted buzzing continued and she went up for air. The single tracker jacker that had watched for her had tried to get her through the water. Now it was dead. Her vision swam and her head pounded. The sky turned red and then flickered to purple. Creatures swarmed around her in the water, picking at her clothing, her skin. No, leave me alone. She clambered for shore and crawled onto the scorched grass. Why was it scorched? Had there been a fire? As she flopped onto the ground, her head connected with a boot. Ah! So little energy to fight. She didn't want to fight, but she turned her head so she could see who stood above her. You killed me. The boy from 10. His voice echoed around her like they were trapped in a bottle. You did. She blinked and suddenly he was on the other side of her. No, I didn't mean to. His eyes rolled back in his head and, another blink, he disappeared. The world swirled and Prim squeezed her eyes tight to keep herself from panicking. I didn't mean to. Consciousness fled and she melted into the darkness. The capital anthem blared and Prim woke with a shriek. Her eyes flew open, landing her gaze on the pictures of fallen tributes in the sky. Glimmer and the boy from 10. No one from her family. She breathed easier and felt guilty for the relief coursing through her. A hand clapped over her mouth and her scream slammed against the person's palm. Sure, Prim, it's me. Peter. She spun and launched into his arms. Oh, Peter. You're okay. Everyone's okay. Well, everyone but the boy from 10. And Glimmer. She should feel remorse, but she didn't. What was wrong with her? Was she a monster now? He hugged her back and continued to speak in a whisper. We need to go. I've been waiting for you to wake up. That's when Prim realized she wasn't on the bank of the lake anymore. She was at the edge of the forest near the cornucopia. I would have carried you farther, but the tracker jacker venom made me weak. You were out a lot longer than I was, I think because you're smaller. Where are Rue and Marvel? She didn't mention Vixenite. Prim had been wrong about her and she waited for Peter to call her out on it. Vixenite had tried to kill everyone. She'd succeeded with 2 tributes. And what happened to the other tributes? Let's just go, Prim. She shied away from his insistence. What will we do then? If they disappeared into the forest, she might never reunite with them. They would die, or she would die, without a goodbye. We can't leave them, Peter. He knelt to match her eye level. If we stay then we'll die, Prim. He wasn't saying they had to leave. He was giving her a choice. She stared at his face, holding his gaze. Why would this boy give so much of his life just for her? Why would he risk his own survival to protect her? You really love Katniss, don't you? He sighed. This isn't about her anymore, Prim. It's not. You're important to me, too, you know. She shook her head. I can't be that important. Not enough for you to die. That's how friendships work. But that's not how the games work. Peter's face broke into a smile, cracking the dried dirt in his cheek creases. We haven't followed the rules of the games from the start. From the way he talked, it sounded like he was open to returning to the others, even if it meant his death. Prim cocked her head to one side. But, do you still care about Katniss? Peter's face turned somber and his eyes searched the air as though sifting through a visual Prim couldn't see. Yes. I still care about her. Very much. His hands tightened on Prim's shoulders and she watched his face crumple. His left hand slid away from her and covered his eyes. He said nothing, just shook his head. Oh Peter. Prim hugged him, though it felt like a poor form of comfort for whatever was going through his head. Had been so distracted by her tribute family that she'd neglected Peter. He was family, too, more so than any of the others. Would she endanger him to save the rest of her family? Peter leaned away and stood with his shoulders back and a new air of leadership, but his eyes were a bit redder than before. So, Miss Primrose, what would you like to do? She gave one more glance back toward the cornucopia, her heart twinging inside her. I'll follow you, Peter. Deep breath. Into the forest. Goodbye family. Be safe. 35. 8 of us left. Peter threw a stick into the river and Prim tried not to think about 6 people dying. There had to be another way. I think we should camp out until the number lessens. He didn't say, until they kill each other off, but Prim knew that's what he meant. I hate the games, she whispered. Me too. She rolled some nuts around on the palm of her hand. The dark berries she'd carried around in her pocket were mostly smashed and smeared from all the running, fighting, and swimming that happened since she picked them. She took what remained and tossed them in the dirt. What had happened to everyone? Glimmer died. Marvel was now alone. What was he doing about it? Rue and Thresh were alive, they were still together, right? He'd take care of Rue, wouldn't he? Cato and Clove, alive. Murderous. The greatest threat because they weren't part of the family. Vixenite the traitor. She still lived. What would Prim do if she encountered her again? There was no moon tonight. Only stars, and they made the forest and recent experiences feel that much darker and doomed. Prim's head still swam from the tracker jacker venom. She wouldn't be able to sleep, not after all that happened. Why do you think Vixenite turned on us? I don't think she was ever on our side. She had a good plan. Peter nodded, resting his forearms on his knees. And you had good reflexes. I would have died without you helping me get away from Clove. I'm surprised more people didn't die. Actually, the more Prim thought about it, the less surprised she was. That nest had been in Vixenite's pack for days. She even floated it down the river. The tracker jackers were probably suffocating and half were most likely dead. How did she even get one of those things in her bag? Peter glanced up at the sky. Probably from the fire. I bet the smoke put them all to sleep or even killed some. Pretty smart on her part. Prim's breath puffed out in front of her. When did it get so cold? Peter stilled, staring at the river. She followed his gaze. Ice. Ice built on the edge, spreading toward the center. Peter was on his feet in a flash, building a fire and striking some rocks together. Quick, gather some water, Prim. The temperature continued to plummet. She filled the small bottle that remained, her hands shaking by the time she screwed the cap on. A spark caught light and Peter blew on it gently. Prim imagined him doing this over the bread ovens every morning. How lucky she was to have him keeping her alive. Chill seeped into her bones with icy fingers. She wrapped her arms around herself. Do you think it'll get any colder? Maybe. What if the others see our fire? She tried not to imagine Cato's leering face creeping out of the shadows. But with the way the temperature was dropping, he'd be lucky to survive a trek through the woods. We have to risk it. The river's half frozen already. So was Prim's nose. Were the game makers doing this to kill off more tributes? Hadn't they seen enough death today? Maybe they were angry with her for helping save Thresh, or for not playing by their rules. The fire crackled loud enough to alert anyone nearby. Prim swiveled her head, peering into the shadows, but their mystery frightened her. Peter reached for her. Come here. She didn't feel awkward letting him hug her to give her warmth. Peter was Big Brother. As cool as Gale was, Prim never really saw him as the cozy Big Brother type. He was more of a hunter, defender, and warrior type. Try to go to sleep. No. Sleep meant reliving the day's events through memories and dreams. Fear over her family. Too much thinking. She almost wished for Tracker Jacker Venom to send her into a short coma. Just try, Prim. Had he read her mind? She snuggled closer, trying to ignore the faces creeping into her mind. She'd killed Glimmer by letting Vixen Eat enter the cornucopia area. Worse than that, she'd killed the boy from 10. No one needed to tell her. Her stone took him down and the Tracker Jackers did the rest. Prim was a murderer. A monster. She was no different than any of the other killers in these games and she hated herself for it. What was worse was knowing Katniss and her family back home were probably proud of her for finally killing. That made everything worse. A single tear squeezed its way onto her cheek before it froze to her skin. 36. So cold. Prim couldn't breathe. Couldn't move. She didn't have enough energy to shiver. Eat, A. No response. Their fire was out. Darkness hovered like death's blanket. It took every ounce of energy for Prim to open her eyes. Beneath the icy moonlight, she made out Peter's face. Pale. Bluish. Frozen. Her eyes shut of her own accord. She wouldn't mind dying just now. Anything to get away from this cold. Hot. Sweat. Too much to breathe. Prim's eyes flew open and her body screamed for attention. Daylight. The sun hung overhead, too close and too hot. From beside her, Peter groaned. Sweat plastered the hair to his head. She pushed away from him, trying to get cooler. This made no sense. Wasn't she freezing last night? She glanced at the river. The water line was lower, but no longer frozen. Water. Cool, clear, refreshing. She crawled toward it as Peter groaned and rolled over. She plunged her hands below the water's surface, but withdrew them with a hiss. It's hot. The water is scalding. Only then did she notice the steam coming off the top. Peter crouched beside her. Looks like the game makers have come out to play. What do we do? Prim scratched an itch on her left hand. She knew these parts of the games. It almost always happened when the numbers thinned and tributes had a higher chance of hiding from one another. People were bored and the game makers were impatient. Well, our bottle is filled with water right now, so we're good. For now. That wouldn't be long enough. Both her hands now itched and she rubbed them against the rough material of her pants. How she hated burns. I think we'd be able to fill the bottle without touching the water. Then it would cool as we walked. Peter grabbed her arm. What's wrong with your hands? I burned them in the water. Sweat built in every crease of her body. They needed to get moving and find some shade, or a cave. These aren't burns. Trust me, I'm a baker's son. I know burns. Besides, your hands wouldn't itch right after being burned. At the word itch, Prim's skin prickled and she pulled it away from him long enough to scratch the now red surface. Then, what's wrong with me? The itching increased. Oh no, had she been infected with something? Was it going to spread to the rest of her body and kill her? I think the water's poisoned. At Peter's word poisoned, a cannon goes off. Prim screamed and then clapped her hands over her mouth. And now I'm willing to bet someone just drank it. Peter, what do we do? One bottle of water wouldn't be enough. I bet the lake isn't poisoned. I bet they're trying to make us all go there. She wasn't ready. She wasn't ready for the showdown, they only just escaped. Peter stood and took off his coat. We'll die in the forest, if we must. We won't go meet Cato and Clove. Yes, but what if Rue and Thresh and Marvel did? Prim's family would be slaughtered. She hated the idea of them all fighting to the death. But this was the Hunger Games. Everyone would die eventually. Prim wouldn't be a part of it. Ah, but you already have, a nasty voice whispered in her mind. When you killed the boy from 10. No. Prim slapped her hand on the ground. Peter stilled. Her cheeks warmed. You mean, you want to go back to the cornucopia? She shook her head and stood up. No, never mind. She looked up at him and her chin quivered. I'm afraid I'm going crazy, Peter. And that, I'm a monster. He gave her a hug, which would have been comforting had they both not been covered in sweat. It was just hot. Too hot. You're not a monster, Prim. It was easy for him to say, but he didn't know what she did. Let's go find some food, okay? She nodded and helped him gather the supplies. She'd tell him if they survived. She'd tell him she killed the boy from 10. But if they died in the games, which was the more probable outcome, then she wouldn't have to tell anyone. The problem was, the whole world already knew. They all saw it on TV. But Peter's opinion was the only one that mattered to Prim anymore. They trekked through the woods as quietly as possible, which wasn't very quiet in the end. The heat grew and grew, the farther into the day they got. All the berry plants were dried up, no juice left in any of the berries. They wilted further as the day went on, the sun burning up even the coolest shadows. Peter and Prim drank half their tiny water supply before mid-afternoon. We have to find a cave, Peter rasped. Prim only nodded and trudged after him. Grass and moss turned brown and crunchy. Prim kept her eyes half shut because the heat burned into her skull. Peter shed his shirt. Prim wanted to shed her own clothing, but not even the hottest temperatures would convince her to show her underclothes to the rich Capital viewers. Here, this might work. Prim looked up at Peter's voice. The rock cropping they stood before was the same one in which Marvel had spared Prim's life. She hid here from the fire. Marvel could very well be in there right now. Prim didn't care. In fact, she almost hoped he was. Peter entered cautiously, then called her in after him. No Marvel. Her heart sank, but despite the sadness there was finally relief from the heat. I wonder who died, Peter mused. Prim didn't want to think about it, but when night fell, bringing back the icy chill and torment, the anthem blared and revealed Vixnut's sly smile. So she's gone now. She should have known better, Prim spat. Vixnut was smarter than that. It contradicted her cunning for her to die by the water, but I suppose since she was a scavenger, even her sharp wits would deceive her for the sake of hunger and thirst. Then again, she might not have died by the water at all. Only 7 of us left. The number still sounded like a lot, especially because Prim dearly cared for 4 of the 7. Her breath fogged in front of her again and Peter rose from his spot in the cave. We need to get out and make a fire again. We'll freeze faster in here. This time, let's dig some burrows in the ground. That should help us stay warm enough. Prim's joints popped as she stood, her feet already numb. It feels colder than last time. I think it probably is. They exited the cave. I wanted to wait for the heat to subside before we started working, but the game makers are changing the temperatures like a light switch. No time in between. Prim pulled her coat tight around her. Oh, what she wouldn't give for the day's heat again. And for some water. And food. Her tongue rubbed light sandpaper against the roof of her mouth, but she didn't bring it up to Peter. He was doing all he could for her and, if there was a way to gather food then he would have found it. They located a good spot with fallen tree trunks and a lot of dead leaves for insulation, but just as Peter struck a light into the kindling his spine jolted up straight. Did you hear that? Prim's heart startled like a loosed bird. She shook her head, but then a noise reached her ear. A high-pitched, animal yap. A growl. 1. 2. A pack. Coyotes. Peter shook his head. No. Wolves. And I'm willing to bet they're not your normal everyday wolves, either.